We broadcast on the 13th of December. Unlucky for some, lucky for some, I don't know, whatever. I'm not tridextophobic, but I do know what tridextophobic means. Isn't that impressive? Because I used to live in a house. Anyway, so let's get on with the news section from Andrew, who's been keeping up to date with the supervillain Omicron. We've decided it's definitely Omicron.
I'm still butchering the pronunciation half the time, I'd say. Yeah, it's not good.
No.
Really not good at this stage. So what we've seen in the last couple of days is some fairly good case data coming out of both Denmark and the UK. And it's alarming because it's showing similar or indeed greater rates of increase than what were already seen in South Africa. Denmark has got a very vaccinated population, very high one. In the UK, the Omicron cases over 5 days have increased sixfold. So if you go back 5 days, there were 249 cases detected, and today there were 1,546. And Denmark is seeing something very similar. In fact, Denmark now has a much higher incidence than we do in terms of the 17-day one. Now, so far in Ireland, we've 10 cases detected.
17 or 14 day?
7.
7? Oh, yeah. 7 day incidents. Okay.
So far in Ireland, there's 10 cases detected. There's others suspected. We don't know how many. But in terms of, say, positive swabs, we're not yet seeing a signal of a suspicious surge. So it's probably out there and replicating, but hasn't got to be big numbers as yet. But we could be quite close to that. I think that's the lesson from the other two, is that really it will quite rapidly appear. There's one estimate that London may be already seeing about 30 to 40% of cases.
So, yeah, what I'm trying to understand is, so there's a 5-fold increase in cases in the Denmark instance. There was 5-fold within, what was that, within a week?
So sorry, I'll just give you two ones. In the UK, it was 5-fold 6-fold in 5 days. Get that right around. In Denmark, over the course of 10 days, they went from 3 cases detected 10 days back to, in the most recent day that they full data for, 581. So it basically went from 3 to 581 in 10 days.
Oh my God. Okay. And the Scotland thing also is interesting in terms of, like, I remember the day after, very quickly after this was talked about, I think by the Monday, it was announced on the Friday, by the Monday Scotland said they had 9 cases.
Yeah, they had.
And now they're talking about, they've gone into a lockdown, a real kind of lockdown, as opposed to the level 4 in the UK. And they have said that it's now the dominant variant. Is it?
In Scotland already, is it? I missed that.
I think it's like, well, I think they were saying that it was due to become the dominant variant.
Yeah, Scotland had done a bit better than other places at getting cases down, so it probably would rise to dominance quicker in that situation than in, say, England, where there was a lot of cases to catch up with in the first place. And one of the interesting things is, I mean, people were initially talking about it as if it would replace Delta in a similar way to the way Delta replaced Alpha.
Yeah.
But actually, there's a few people now pointing out that maybe not. What we may actually have is 2 parallel surges. One, the continuing Delta one, and one Omicron, because it's basically its main advantage is being able to infect people who've already been infected and probably also who've been vaccinated. Whereas Delta's is a simple speed of transmission. So, in fact, it may have relatively little impact on Delta, a short-term dip, and then Delta will continue as it probably would have before. Whereas with Omicron, there'll probably be a wave, which will be very substantial. So that's kind of what we're looking at, which is quite... So that's the first time we've really seen that in this part of the world, because generally the pattern we've seen is one variant replacing another. But
so the Delta, explain to me, the Delta one is getting to people who've never been infected at all. And
or whose immunity has waned, whereas Omicron is overcoming immunity. Basically, it's able to bypass it. to at least some extent. I mean, we still don't know exactly how much, but the early tests they've been doing, and there's quite a lot have now been done in different places, would suggest it's quite significant. Either if you've previously been infected, or if you've only had 2 doses of vaccine, or definitely if you've only had 1, you've got almost no protection.
Wow. Okay. And
against infection.
Where's our cases? Yeah, but a booster. Is there anything about boosters giving you some sort of?
Yeah. There's quite. You get. I mean, we only know for a couple of months after the boosters, because that's all the period that applies to. But they seem to bring you back up to about 75% effectiveness against symptomatic infection.
Okay.
And it will be higher again against severe infection, i.e. hospitalisation or whatever. But it's probably the case that, it's speculative. It may be a bit less effective against hospitalisation than would have been the case with Delta, but we don't know that yet. So we'll have more definite data. Now, what we do have in England today was they said they've had the first 10 hospitalisations with Omicron. And the wording of the press release was sort of that these were people being hospitalised where it had been detected prior to hospitalisation, and I think they said that in order to make clear that it was the cause of hospitalisation rather than people breaking a leg and then testing positive or whatever else. So that's worrying, because although 10 doesn't sound like a lot, when I'm calculating case hospitalisation rates for Ireland, for instance, I have a lag of 6 days. So in other words, you look at cases 6 days ago, and that's where the hospitalisations today come from. And of course, because Omicron has grown so quickly, when you go back to 6 days, you're looking at less than 200 cases. So to have 10 people hospitalised from less than 200 cases is actually quite a high rate.
Okay.
It's definitely, it's also, 10 is a small number, so it's too early to say that is going to be the pattern. You'd need to have more. But as an early indicator, it rather suggests this hope that was drifting around that it was going to be milder than Delta is probably not going to be true.
That's unfounded.
Yeah.
Okay, so where are we in terms of cases? Are we still...
We're still bouncing around exactly where we were, essentially. There's been no...
So it's around 4,000, 4,500?
Yeah, 4,400. There's essentially been no change in a month. I'm just looking at a graph of it here, of the swabs. And the cases bumped up and down according to lab capacity and things like that. But the swabs are pretty much a straight line at about 4,500 a day for 30 days. I suspect within that there's periods where we weren't testing enough, so it was actually above that. And also, of course, the storm disrupted figures in the last week for 2 days. But yeah, at best we've had a plateau for the last month. It might really be an incline, and perhaps an incline and a more recent decline, but appearing as a plateau because of limitations for how many could test. So we've seen the one, in terms of bits of positive news, the case hospitalisation rate has dropped to 1.3% and been at that low for 3 days. Now, that's been as high as 4.6% briefly a couple of months back. And even 1.3% is probably about 40% of the typical rate. No, hold on, 60% of the typical rate. So that's kind of helpful, because it means that rather than getting that sort of 1,000 people in hospital by now, we have 517. So there's a little bit more room. But the big problem is with Omicron transmission being so fast, if it's hospitalising people at anything like the same rate, even if it's at half that rate, you'd be in trouble really, really quickly with it. So
then, if we're talking about that, it just seems to have been ongoing for months now, of 4,000 cases.
Yeah.
So that's Delta then. We're still pretty certain that's Delta.
We're
dealing with...
There's not a significant amount of Omicron here yet.
Yeah.
Insofar as we know. Now, it may be coming to significance even as we speak.
Because
there's quite a lag.
There's a 10-day lag,
yeah.
right? Okay, so that's one part of it. But then, with Delta going at that rate, we haven't really seen any kind of decline either. How long can it keep up at 4,400?
Oh, right.
When are we... Surely to Christ, there's a point where that has to start declining. I mean, it's got to everybody, or
so this is one of the debates that's been happening over the last few months, because it became obvious that protection against infection was waning over a period of 4 to 6 months, right? The older you are, the quicker that tends to happen. And what that would mean is that, and this is also the case for vaccination, so what that would mean is that while it might be the case that 4,000 people a day, which is probably really 8,000 a day, are getting infected and then have some immunity, that only lasts, say, 4 to 5 months. And so when you do the maths on that sort of basis, then basically the book, it's filling as quickly as it's emptying from that, that's the problem. So that was why we had the booster program happening even before Omicron showed up.
Right.
But it's been what they've now done, and this has also happened in England, is they're trying to roll it out faster to more of the population. I mean, there's a weird story going on with the HSC in that they've largely switched to using Moderna in all the centres, and the stories coming out today that with some of the staff of the centres are saying that they've realised that there's something like 2 million doses that have to be used by the 16th of January, that we're going out of date, in other words. Right. And that's ridiculous, because that should never have been allowed to happen, because in order to use all them by the 16th of January, they're going to have to get 300,000 a day, which is close to the peak that they were hitting the last time around. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe it will turn out that it's a bit more complex than that, or maybe it was the case that they were about to give them away or something, I don't know. But that's another aspect of the kind of story as it develops at the moment.
Okay, so then help me understand this. We have a wave that Delta just keeps going, right? And now we have another possible new wave, which we don't know about. So we keep waiting for like a week's more data and a week's more data. We're not really getting any more. We don't seem to be getting much more information about Omicron. It'll come at a point where, will it just appear in such a way that it'll just be another surge? Like, I mean.
Oh, you mean in Ireland?
Yeah, in Ireland.
Yeah. So if you remember, both with Alpha and with Delta, there was quite a protracted period where we knew it existed. We knew there'd been a case or two here. It started to increase in numbers, and then suddenly it took off. Yeah. And so it'll be exactly the same.
Exactly the same thing.
It's basically just exponential growth.
It's going to shoot up.
Yeah. So initially it doesn't look like much. You're sort of saying, well, there's 10 cases detected, there's 14 cases detected, there's 50 cases detected, and then it will suddenly be 400, 800,
okay, and
2,000.
What we're going through right now with Delta, is that being described as a surge? What is that? Like, I mean, how do people actually officially
I think it's a fourth wave is what it's generally been called.
It's a fourth wave that's just been lasted for 4 months. And the reason why it's lasting so long is because people basically are coming out, they're losing their immunity is waning because we've gone through
a bit of that, and a bit of until recently, primary school kids weren't eligible for vaccination, and only about 30% of secondary school kids weren't vaccinated. So there was quite a big population of those to go through, basically. So although 4,000 a day or 8,000 a day sounds like a lot, there was something like 900,000 not eligible for vaccination. So that's sort of
the only way that they were
days or whatever to work through that.
They were going to go through immunity was by getting it.
Yeah, and so alongside that you have waning immunity, so that particularly the oldest groups who also got vaccinated first were vulnerable to that. So they, we started to see more cases in over 85s. But the other aspect of that was that there were quite a lot of cases in the sort of 35 to 44-year-old age group, which a lot of people were interpreting as that's parents basically being affected by the kids. So that aspect going on as well.
Okay, so then Omicron, it's inevitably going to arrive. When it does arrive, it's just going to shoot up, right?
Yeah, well, it's here. I mean, we know it's here. And so we can say it probably is shooting up in the background. I mean, there's some vague chance we've been lucky and that the first cases got intercepted and they're not really spreading much. But I mean, basically,
well, we're going to have Christmas.
No, exactly. That's what I was going to say. If London is at 40% of cases being that, and we know people will obviously be coming back for Christmas, then we can be certain that Christmas week and the aftermath, we'll see an explosion of those cases, even if we haven't seen it in what is it, about 10 days now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was,
I
it
would
was
suspect
like
we'll-
the Friday before last Friday was when we really started knowing
Yeah.
about it.
I would
That's 2 weeks,
suspect by the end of the weekend, and certainly by midweek, we'll start seeing a significant number of cases, and it'll be obvious we're seeing the same sort of growth.
Okay. And then, so yeah. So this doesn't look good. No matter what angle you look at it from, it doesn't look good. And what's the reaction been in terms of, are NPHET still not doing press conferences? Have the HSE spoken about
There's an
it?
NPHET meeting Thursday.
Right.
There haven't been any press conferences, and actually there wasn't a HSE one last week either.
Oh my
I think,
God.
or was there? I'm trying to remember. Did I see one? Maybe I did get one. No, maybe there was. I think maybe, yeah. I think I just a lot going on, so maybe I just had less time to process it. But actually, I think there was one. So there's still this political gagging of NPHET is still ongoing in the background. There's been very little in the way of interviews and stuff. And it's funny because I've seen the kind of denialist lot are now complaining, because that basically means that some of the independent scientific advisory group people who are kind of, the zero COVID people essentially are now getting more radio time, because of course the media can't get people who are from NPHET on. So that's kind of upset them, which is quite entertaining. So there's a bit of a vacuum, to put it mildly, in terms of what's going on. Because normally, if we think about the Alpha and Delta surges, that have been the press conferences, that there have been radio appearances, and journalists would have been able to say, well, okay, so you found 10 cases so far, but how many cases are being investigated?
Yeah.
And you'd normally, because it's a press conference type situation, you'd get a number, maybe not an exact number, but you get a ballpark number, and and they tell you how many S gene dropout ones there are. We're not hearing any of that information.
So
at the
we've
moment.
got nothing.
So we don't know. Yeah, exactly.
But what we do know for a fact is Delta continues to rock along at a quite alarming pace, at really high cases. And what we do know is that every single other variant, when it actually has become dominant, or when it goes like Alpha and Delta do, will just basically shoot up. And in the midst of all that information, we have got a kind of media blackout and no real plan. Anything from
there was a quote from, it might have been Jack Chambers or somebody, saying he didn't think there'd be additional restrictions before Christmas. I basically think
Jack Chambers who is he? He's just
I think the intention is they want to not bring in anything in addition. The government side of it.
Nobody wants to cancel Christmas, no matter what. No matter what happens.
Now to Christmas.
Right.
And I mean, Micheál Martin literally used wait and see in terms of Omicron the other day, which is ludicrous, because if we can see what's happening in Denmark, we can see what's happening in England. There was an argument that maybe South Africa would be different than Ireland for whatever reasons. You could maybe make that sort of argument. You can't really say, well, maybe Britain will be different
on the basis of the Denmark data and the basis of
they're both countries with very high levels of vaccination, so they're more comparable to us. That's where we are with that. I don't think we're not going to rerun something as bad as last year, I think. However, I think we could the failure to act at this stage, I think, is going to push us into a lockdown in the new year. And possibly before that. I mean, it depends how, it might become quite obvious in the next few days things are getting desperate. It was, I think it was December 16th last year where it became obvious, if you were paying attention, that we were getting in serious trouble. But then it wasn't until like the 20th that it became very definitely obvious in a way that couldn't be ignored. And of course they didn't, the last of the measures was December 31st or whatever, so we could well see a rerun of something similar on a very similar time scale. And the big difference is that although Omicron may well be able to overcome protection against infection in vaccinated people who've only had 2 doses, or largely do that, there's the most vulnerable section of the population is getting boosted at the moment. And you can see that in sort of in the hospital stats with Delta. That should hold up to some extent, right?
Right.
And also, everybody getting infected who has been vaccinated will still have much more protection against being hospitalised or needing ICU or dying than they would have previously. So that's why I'm saying I don't think it could look like last January. I'm just nervous about, the problem is if it's 50,000 cases a day, well then if your vaccination it means you're cutting 90% of the outcomes off. That is last January, you know, because you 50,000 instead of 10,000 or whatever, you know, like the math starts coming out the same way. So that's why I think the lack of timely intervention now could be pushing us into another lockdown, and probably not that far away.
And is there, I mean, I just find this entire thing so frustrating because, like, no lessons learned, no fast action, no resolutions in relation to actually saying, okay, like, we've seen how this works. And now it's got even worse in terms of, like, absolutely silencing the people that they set up as the experts. So, and how many people died, like, last week? What are the deaths like? What are we now at?
So I think there were 81 deaths notified, but the usual thing that those actually are spread out over recent months. However, looking at so we now have October and November both at over 200 deaths by date of death in it, right? So 200 plus people died in those months. So I would expect there to be at least 300 in. I think actually November may well hit 300 once, you know, in 2 months' time. When we're looking back from January or February, it may well have reached 300. December, maybe 300. Even this is before Omicron.
Yeah,
will probably also.
But that's what that was my point. Like, where like, it now seems like whatever it is, 200 or 300 deaths is just an acceptable price for keeping everything open and just getting towards Christmas, making sure that everybody buys their presents. And, and, like, I just don't understand why people aren't just out in the streets about it. Like, I mean, it's like, I mean, if this goes, like, even if it isn't as bad as last Christmas, it's all so going to become very obvious who's responsible again. So I have no idea what their planning is. What are the spin doctors? What are they possibly saying to them that will get them off the hook this time?
I think the straightforward answer is that this calculation has been done by other people on the inside of all this, and it's been accepted that that's an acceptable level of deaths. You know, which is why there's so little focus on that figure for the moment.
This is the sweet spot in the Venn diagram.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, so we've been talking about this for a few months, that basically the living with COVID strategy basically means you've permanent bad flu, you know. So that's, you know, it was often used as a way of minimizing or denying COVID, where people said, oh, it's no worse than a bad flu year, which wasn't true pre-vaccine, right? But it was fairly obvious before Omicron that post-vaccine, with everything open, that's, you know, you're basically looking at a really bad, not just a bad flu season, but a whole year that has the same sort of mortality. So, you know, like, most recent bad flu year, I think we had about 1,100 deaths. But so instead you're talking about somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 probably.
Yeah.
And it not being clear if it's going to keep staying at that figure for year after year for a number of years, or if it will slowly come down from that. That's the. I mean, I saw the ECDC just published a report on nursing homes across Europe and outbreaks post-vaccination, so from July, I think, to October. Yeah. And it's interesting because the mortality rate, it was 10%. You know, like, it varied a bit country by country, and it kind of, one of the interesting things that actually, it turned out one of the things that really affected it was how quickly they realised there was a problem and shut it down. But that would give you a sort of ballpark thing of what it might look like every year going forward. You know, because that used to be the case with flus. Like, flu could get into a nursing home and you'd have quite a significant mortality from it because people in that situation are quite vulnerable to it. Or, you know, immunocompromised people in hospital. There's a whole, you know, there's categories of people that flu was really bad for them if they got it.
Yeah.
So I think we're probably looking at something similar. And the question really will be, will Omicron change that significantly, in that maybe that becomes a much bigger thing than what they've been talking about. And what will certainly happen is that the thinking with Delta, I think, was very much that, okay, so this is going to be the situation, particularly while we're waiting for people to get vaccinated or survive their first infection. And so we're going to have a few months of that. And the current period we were in, I think, were thought of as the few months in which the people who just wouldn't get vaccinated would get infected. Most of them would survive. Those who would need ICU would use that. And then that problem would then kind of go away.
That was the plan. Yeah, so we have one, but we seem to have had one plan, and we seem to have this impossible. There seems to be no alternative plans. Like, there is literally no plan B. I mean, and I can understand from that perspective, because you also had the 900,000 or whatever the population is of the children, right? So we couldn't do with that. We had to. It was inevitable that they would have to get immunity through the process of actually getting it, and we had to have a health system that could deal with them and also deal with the people who weren't vaccinated. But now we're at a stage where this has been ongoing for months and months and months, and also we know that there's a new variant on the way, and in all of that there has never been any idea of an alternative plan. In fact, it's got worse, because now they seem to be silencing the only people that can tell us the information that we need on which to base decisions going forward. But sure, it makes sense to silence them, because if you don't have any kind of plan, then why would you want to get exposed to questions about, is there another plan? Because there doesn't seem to be. Dealing with.
Yeah, so let's go back to June and the whole Johnson strategy, which was also the one for the North.
Oh yeah, well we need to
because
talk about
this is the kind of really
tragic
bit of this story, is that the whole selling point of that strategy was the realization that Delta would be an ongoing thing, that the pressure on the hospital system would be greater in winter, so therefore that by opening early, you
Freedom Day, June 21 or whatever it was.
You get that over with, because you get people infected.
Turned out to be July. It got pushed back
in the quiet time of the year for the hospitals.
Yeah.
And so that therefore when we got to this time, they'd be under much less pressure.
Yeah.
And it kind of became obvious about a month ago this wasn't working, because they were still having the same case rates as we had once we opened up 4 months later. So that didn't seem to be much of a benefit.
And then constantly these rumours have gone, oh, maybe we've hit peak now.
Yeah, all the time. Peak. Yeah, every time there's a little dip.
Yeah, maybe we've hit peak, and we've seen none of that.
Yeah, and with Scotland, it looked like maybe that had happened, although, again, maybe it would have been a dip. But the problem is that Omicron has just destroyed that plan.
Yeah.
It's just, the value, it may turn out, it probably will turn out, that there is some value in it, and at least those who survived that got infected in that period, which most people obviously are probably less susceptible to needing hospital or ICU. Right. Those should be, the protection against severe disease should be stronger, etc., etc. That's nearly everybody thinks that's going to be the case, because that's generally the way these things work. But the idea would contain the wave of infection has just gone, oh, right, there goes that.
But have we ever, in any of the data yet, has anybody actually definitively found a point where we've actually hit that point where it starts to dip?
It's quite hard to call, actually. It is arguable that maybe what happened in India with Delta last year, and also what happened in South Africa actually with Delta, was that there was a wave, cases peaked, and actually what brought that back down again was not so much about measures, but about everybody had been infected at that stage, and so so you had a period of immunity basically following that. It's kind of it's really hard to actually know, because we also have Lake Manus in Brazil, where it just kept going and going and going, so it could be that there was truth to that in the short term.
But I'm more from the point of view of the Western perspective of we just power on through and we get to that point.
Generally,
hasn't been
no Western
anywhere.
country actually did that in the end. Like everybody backed down and brought in restrictions as the hospitals were. Because the problem is, in order to do that, in actual fact, no country is going to have hospital capacity. So you have to be willing to accept the sort of stuff that did happen in India and Indonesia and other places where people couldn't get places for their relatives, so they were trying to bribe doctors. There was people going out buying oxygen privately. There was the price of oxygen went shooting up. I mean, there's particular noticeable social impacts of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas generally what happened in Western Europe or America was when you got to the point that there were queues of ambulances trying to get into the hospital and all that sort of stuff, that's when various measures were brought in that then reduced that pressure, and there were brief periods of overrun rather than. That's why we had lockdowns basically, because every lockdown was triggered by that happening, and that's maybe where we're going to be going again basically with this. The question really is what we don't know yet, and as I said, that's why those 10 hospitalizations in England are a bit worrying. What is the hospital pressure going to be? The fact that we got our hospital case rate down to 1.3%, which is really low in comparison to what it had previously been, is that going to remain the case with Omicron, or is it going to be the case that actually it starts to rise again? So that's the stat I'm going to be looking at as Omicron sort of starts to roll out here.
And when are we going to have, when are we going to, how long do we have to wait for data on this?
Good hospitalisation data is about a week after the case data. However, there's a general problem with all the ways that what happens initially is that younger and healthier people get infected because they're the ones who are out and about, and then it takes a while before they infect parents and grandparents. So you can't. The start of most waves, apart from the first one, was a different situation.
Build-up
you can't really tell from the start of most waves where hospitalisation data is going to go. It takes you need to wait till it gets into that older population. So yes, and the thing is, even if it stays at 1.3%, well, that's manageable or proved manageable when we 4,500 cases a day. It wouldn't be manageable at 45,000 cases a day. So that's why I suspect we're back to looking at a lockdown scenario, because it looks like Omicron has such a short doubling time that cases will just get out of hand very, very quickly if you've got any sort of back to normal type situation at all.
Okay, but we definitely need to look at the data, and it would be nice if NPHET actually came back on stream in some way so that we could have journalists ask questions like that and get some data. But the other aspect I wanted to talk about was so in the UK, right, which has always been the kind of the test case for how to push it. They did this lockdown, but the lockdown that they've talked about, or they've raised it up to a level, has no implications in terms of...
There's no real policy changes yet. No
policy changes.
They've declared a level 4, and I think they're going to introduce vaccine certs for nightclubs next week or something. So,
not really taking it seriously then.
Yeah, so I mean, the Danish and UK data in terms of the Omicron rise is quite alarming. However, they are more open than we are, so we may not see quite the same sort of rate.
Right.
I mean, the obvious problem, you can say that now, but with increased socialisation around Christmas, that could cancel that out entirely. Really depends on what people are doing, how people are going to react to this. Now, I've seen lots of restaurants giving out online that nobody's going out, and people complaining about their office parties being cancelled because half the people don't want to go and the rest of them went home at 10:30 because it was no crack because people, everyone hadn't gone. I saw that tweet just before it came up here.
That's great, yeah.
So I mean, those sort of social changes could have a fairly significant impact on that speed of transmission if the reaction here has been different than it was in England. Because obviously the messaging in England was very much, no, just go ahead with your Christmas parties, don't worry about it, where that wasn't quite the same messaging here. But I think so that might slow down that rapid rate of increase, which at least will give us a bit more time to react to it.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm kind of, I'm looking for hopeful bits.
I agree, there's not much else to look at. That's like clutching at straws, all right.
I mean, essentially we're back to cut down your social contacts. Don't meet people indoors. Don't meet people less often. use masks, antigen testing after stuff to see if you've picked up infections.
All the responsible
all the
stuff.
old stuff, but there's definitely a big problem with people are just kind of exhausted with it and are just resistant to going back to that again. And I guess the advantage we have of being a couple of weeks behind England is that at least we're seeing what's happening now, and so that's probably getting people who are trying not to pay attention to go, okay, God, this is happening again. Which is where I feel like I'm in that situation as well.
I think everybody's just mentally exhausted dealing with this shit constantly. But but tell me about, is Scotland's lockdown different to England's?
I actually don't know the details. I do know they seem to have declared more serious measures, and people who know what they're talking about are saying we might see a change in cases there. I think Denmark has also just done something similar.
Because I saw, I happened to see Nicola Sturgeon's press conference on sometime at the weekend, and basically what she seemed to be saying was this data demands this reaction, and I don't know why the rest of the UK is not it was like a shot across the bows at Johnson, as if that's going to have any effect. But so it'd be interesting to see if that's a model that we need to follow. I mean, if they're, I don't know, you constantly hope for different actions, but all you see is inaction most of the time. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, we don't really know why Omicron has been so successful. We know it has ways of overcoming immunity, right?
Yeah.
It's possible it's actually less fit than Delta in other ways, so it's less transmissible. It could be that if you had two naive populations, the error rate will actually be lower with Omicron. That's possible. We don't know yet. So, and the thing is, we in both Denmark and Britain were very open.
Yeah.
Obviously, nightclubs, no sites, and that by definition, that's very open. So, we don't know quite how quickly it's going to reproduce here. What's the error rate going to be in the Irish context with current measures? I mean, we know its household attack rate is high, so we know if it gets into a household, then yes, it's going to infect other people.
Yeah.
And vaccination, particularly if it's on boosted vaccination, is not going to be much protection against that. You get infected, you probably won't get as sick as you would have previously, but some people will, which is the problem.
Yeah.
So I mean, that question of what will that look like? What will it look like? What's it going to look like, for instance, in a school setting?
Yeah.
Where
all the kids have already got Delta.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or a lot of them have got Delta. So how is it going to hit communities that have had quite high rates of infection previously? So, you think marginalised communities like Travellers, for instance, where also, of course, a lot of people would have only got the single shot Johnson, which is very little effectiveness at all against it.
Right.
So there's kind of a whole meat plants. Is that going to blow up and become an issue again? What's this actually going to look like in practice here? I think is quite tricky. And then
because we're going to replay the same thing again with a different variant. That's basically what we're going to do.
And
hit the same spots, the same vulnerable communities. All of the same thing will get played out again.
Yeah, and I guess, but what I'm also driving in with all that is, optimistically, maybe it's the case that you don't need the sort of lockdown we had last year. Maybe, as we were doing with Delta, a relatively minor set of measures, really. I mean, life was relatively normal for a lot of people. Would control it. Now, we know that's not going to be the case with Omicron. It's going to need more, but the question is how much more? How different will it need to be, But the problem is, if the current government strategy seems to be to ignore it till Christmas is over with.
Yeah, let's just keep the wheels on until everyone's spent all their money.
And we know that when we did that last year, that we just ended up with such a caseload that actually suppressing that caseload required a very severe lockdown. So I'm a little bit concerned that might be where we end up again.
Yeah.
But it's still... We've more data than we did this time last week, or the last time we talked about it, but it's not... it's still quite sparse.
Very hard to call.
Yeah.
And muzzling NPHET is not helping. So I'm just trying to remember what did we end up with in terms of after we went through? I know it's different because of vaccination and immunity and everything else, but replay what happened last year when we got through. What were the cases like? The cases were at 200 when we were going into Christmas.
Yeah, so 240, or 270 around December the 4th when we opened up.
Right. And then we got to, very quickly that kind of grew to, so we were over 1,000. Were we 1,000 or 1,200 or 1,500 or something?
We
by
hit
Christmas.
We probably hit 1,200 around the 24th, 25th. Now there was a whole thing with obviously people not getting tested over Christmas itself.
Yeah.
Then the reporting system broke down, so there was that period of time where it was going.
Yeah.
This is pretty bad because there's 2,500 positive swabs, but they're only reporting 800 cases.
Yeah.
So there was that. So we don't have a great picture of exactly what was happening.
Right.
But what we know is that by the early new year, they're reporting 5,000, 6,000 cases a day. I think one day was 9,000, but that was mostly a catch up from some of that backlog.
So that's what we got to, and then
and Omicron can definitely do that. Like from the data we're seeing from other countries, we could definitely
we could do that with
again.
a vaccinated population. That's the thing. Okay, and then when last year, so this is January 2021, February 2021, and then what did we get cases down to? What was our lowest point in last year before? Now it seems like
around 300, I think.
Right.
I think we got down to around 300 in late June.
Okay.
Early July.
Yeah, and then
I'm
there
not
was the
100%
vaccination
sure,
rollout and everything else, and now we've just been going back up again. We've been at seems so long that we've been at 4,000 cases, or
we slowly increased into July, and then if you remember the Euros, there was that surge in the Euros where it was quite alarming just after that for a while, but actually it turned out it was just the Euros, so it then went back to a slow level of increase, and then we've had a couple of moments where went shooting up again briefly and then went back to a slow level of increase. So it's kind of, we've mostly had a slow level of increase from June with some sharp punctuations where, for other reasons, not all of which I understand, we had periods of much more rapid growth.
Yeah.
But it's pretty much been all one direction. I mean, the couple of dips that have existed have been quite minor, which is not that different from the pattern we had in 2020.
Yeah.
Again, opening up in June, cases slowly increasing up to December, and then the escalation of cases around now. And of course, we've got more open now than we did this time last year.
Yeah.
By quite a long shot, and people can do much more and all the rest. So that's the that's the thing.
We're just pushing it every single time. The more that being vaccinated allows us to do stuff, we just keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. The only thing they really like doing is this nightclub thing. That nightclubs aren't operating, but even the measures that they brought in around restaurants just seem ludicrously loose to me. Even you separate a table by 1 meter and you have 6 people.
I saw a great one at this, which was somebody was at a gig in, it must have been Kerry now, I don't know if it was a pantomime or a gig or theatre or whatever it was, but they were saying, and obviously somebody was a bit concerned, they ran the venue up in advance, and they said, we're running at 50% capacity, blah blah blah. They got there, and what they had done was they had roped off about half the space, so they basically put the people into
space.
Yeah. So in other words, you were at 100% capacity in this space, and then there was an empty bit over there you couldn't get into.
Yeah. Which is the place you wanted to be in.
Away
from everybody else.
So it sounds like at least some places are being completely idiotic about this, and helping to get us into the next lockdown as a result of that. Who knows what's going on all over the place,
Right.
But yeah.
Okay, so there you go. Is there any other silver linings that you can think of, or is it just another case of wait and see?
No, not really. I mean, I think it's very. I think this has been another one of those times where things over a few days have started to become much more alarming, as you're kind of looking at it and going, this is actually leaning towards the more worst case scenarios.
You think
from
of
the early days of it.
the three lines. We're at the top line. We're not in the middle line. We're
Yeah,
not at the low line.
yeah. Now
The least optimistic. The most pessimistic outcomes.
We'll see, but it's not. As I said, and I'll be interested to see what the reproduction rate, turns out to be here.
Yeah.
Maybe the few differences will make a fairly significant difference. Who knows? But
because the last time, like in the other shows, we were talking about R being 3.5 for Omicron. So, but of course
that
it's
was in
really
South
hard to
African
say.
context. Yeah. But no, I mean the figures we're looking at for Britain and Denmark would be up to, that's probably the upper end of the range. But yeah, quite.
Well,
it's almost a doubling time of 2 to 3 days. That's kind of like pretty.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, let's leave it there for the time being.
All right.